Hi guys, so in this video we'll be discussing fiscal policy, which is a demand side or demand management policy. Within this chapter we'll be discussing what fiscal policy is and why does it exist, the two tools of fiscal policy, the relation of fiscal policy to budget, and then finally parts of fiscal policy. So starting off from what it is and why does it exist, as we just discussed, well, it's a demand side policy. So it is used to manipulate aggregate demand. It's all about aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the demand of all goods and services within an economy. All goods and services within an economy. And so, fiscal policy is a demand management policy. It is used to well manipulate the demand of all goods and services within the economy itself. This is a curve which well tells us why the fiscal policy is used in the first place. So, this curve is known as the business cycle. We also discussed this in the video about monetary policy, right? This whole diagram is known as the business cycle. And so in this case, what we can see as well, this yellow part represents potential growth of the economy, right? This is the potential growth of the economy in the long run. While this crest sort of part, the top crest part represents upswings, and this part represents downswing. So the thing is, this part, the upswings, this part is known as a boom. This is a term. It's always funny, but it's boom. And so during this sort of period, the aggregate demand is high, employment is high, unemployment is low. Obviously, employment is high, consumption is high, and so maybe inflation is also high. So inflation might also be high due to demand pull inflation. On the other hand, over here, this downside part, this is known as a recession, which is a very famous word, recession. So in this time, aggregate demand is low, employment is low, and so obviously unemployment is high, employment is low, probably inflation due to demand pull may also be low, right? And so this is where the government comes in. The government doesn't really want this much fluctuation. The government doesn't really want these two peaks to form. And so the government wants to stabilize the business cycle of an economy. And so the government uses demand side policies such as fiscal policy and monetary policy to flatten the curve out, which is a term which we are hearing nowadays. And so the government wants to really flatten the curve, right? As we can see, this pink sort of dotted line represents what the government wants to do. The government wants to reach as close as possible to the potential growth curve, which is the mean position in this case. So this explains what it is and why fiscal policy exists. Moving on to the tools of fiscal policy. Well, fiscal policy has two different tools. The first tool of fiscal policy is government expenditure. Government expenditure. Now we'll be discussing how this may lead to expansionary. This might lead to an expansionary or a contractionary fiscal policy. Right, so we'll discuss both sides of this. So government expenditure, right? And so in this case, the thing is, the government does earn its money from sources like income tax, corporate tax, VAT, state enterprises and stuff. And the government ends up spending money on national defense, social security, healthcare, education, research, infrastructure. And when the government spends its money, let's say if the government spends its money on maybe making more schools, right? So the government ends up hiring more people. The government hires more people to build the school, people to build. The government hires more people to teach over there. Maybe someone to take care of the school. This is a very macroeconomic sort of example. And so to build the school, to teach over there, and then to take care of the school itself. So when the government, this is also part of government expenditure. When the government spends its money to hire these people, the government obviously pays them, right? And so this leads to income for those people, right? And so when the government hires people, it pays them money, and so well, it causes income. And when there's income, like when they earn income, these people, they will spend this income on goods and services, goods and services. And so, well, it increases aggregate demand because one of the components of aggregate demand is consumption. It's C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And so, this point C, this will increase. Consumption will go up. It will increase. So this is one thing. This is part of the government's expansionary fiscal policy, because expansion means increasing something, and whenever we're talking about fiscal policy, we're talking about aggregate demand, and so this means whenever there's an increase in aggregate demand, government increases its expenditure. But let's say the government was to employ a contractionary fiscal policy, then it would reduce its expenditure, and when the government's expenditure reduces, well, the government is going to spend less money on hiring people. The government is going to spend less money on, let's say in this case, hiring more teachers. Maybe they might just unemploy people or fire people in extreme cases. And so when that happens, well, incomes fall, right? Incomes throughout the whole economy fall, since the government does employ a lot of people, especially in a country like Pakistan, where I think we have around 50 like 100,000, maybe, I think, yeah, 50 lakhs or something people employed. This is not a figure, you can't really quote me on this, but we have a lot of people employed in the government, right? And so the government spends this money to hire more people. It increases aggregate demand by a lot because there are a lot of people employed within the government itself. And so when the government stops really spending money, when the government cuts back on its expenditure, it does cause a significant impact on aggregate demand. And so it might lead to a contractionary fiscal policy if the government cuts back on its expenditure. Right. Moving on to the second tool of fiscal policy. The second tool of fiscal policy, apart from government expenditure, moving on to taxes. Obviously, in this case, we'll discuss expansionary as well as contractionary. So let's say if the government decreases taxes, let's just take direct taxes here. If the government was to decrease, let's say, income tax, then people like you and I who are earning money, who go to work, and then we earn some money, right? We earn money. And so when the government decreases income tax, that way we are spending less money on taxes, because of which our disposable income goes up. Disposable income, well, the concept is such that disposable income is when, or it's termed such, when we subtract tax from our income minus tax paid, direct tax paid, it's going to give us our disposable income. So this is what we get. And so when our disposable income increases, we are able to spend more, right? We can obviously buy more goods and services because now we have more money. And so when we have a higher disposable income, we can spend more, and so the aggregate demand goes up, since consumption goes up. So this is part of expansionary. This is part of the expansionary fiscal policy part of the government. And if we were to look at contractionary, the contractionary it's not really written very well. If you were to look at the contractionary fiscal policy part, then the government would increase taxes. And if the government increases taxes, what happens is, in the first case, when the government was decreasing taxes, our disposable incomes went up. And when the government is going to increase taxes following a contractionary fiscal policy, our disposable income will go down, right? Disposable income goes down. Disposable income, represented by D&I in this case, will go down. And when disposable income goes down, now we can buy less goods and services, and so aggregate demand goes down too. Since we just discussed, it's C plus I plus G plus X minus M, and so consumption by consumers goes down, since well they now have less money, and so aggregate demand goes down too. Right. So we'll move on to budget now. So budget is a document which has the expected revenue and the planned expenditure of the government for the next fiscal year. And obviously, this document is really important for governments, and so it has a lot of functions. The first function is, well, it's a plan or a forecast for the coming year. Obviously, it it really puts forward uh, government's national priorities, and what the government aims to achieve, national priorities, and what the government aims to achieve throughout the next fiscal year, right? And more importantly, the budget documents the government's fiscal position, showing whether the government will choose a expansionary fiscal policy path or a contractionary fiscal policy path. Because if the government does choose an expansionary fiscal policy path to increase aggregate demand, expansionary fiscal policy path, then we'll be looking at more government expenditure as compared to, well, tax revenue. And if we were to, well, focus more on, if the government was to choose to move towards a more contractionary fiscal policy path, then we would look at a budget document which would have more tax revenue as compared to government expenditure, and this would lead to, well, a budget surplus. This would lead to a budget deficit. Now this can also be presented on a diagram. So let's say we make this as a graph, and so the y-axis represents government's revenue and the x-axis represents national income, right? And we can, well, draw a straight line representing tax revenue. This is tax revenue, and this horizontal line, since the government's expenditure, well, more or less is going to remain the same, and so this is, I mean, according to the national income, with relation to the national income, so it's going to become something like this: government expenditure, right? This is the government's expenditure, this is the tax revenue, and this whole area before this point or intersection, this is the point or intersection, this is known as, well, this is the point at which we balance our budget, and so the government's expenditure is equal to the tax revenue, and so we are not in a budget surplus. So this is not the case there. We are not even in a budget deficit, rather we balance the budget, and so this is known as a balanced budget at this point if the government's expenditure equals the tax revenue. But at any point after this, well, since we can see the tax revenue curve outstrips, well, the government expenditure curve, and so at this point T, let's just clean this up a bit, at this point, well, T outstrips G, because of which we will end up with a budget deficit, right? T outstrips G, and so we end up with the budget surplus, obviously, because with the tax revenue is greater than the government expenditure at this point. At any point after this balanced budget point, and at any point before this balanced budget point, we have a lesser tax revenue, because it's, well, below this part, right? It's below this part, and so any point before this we end up with, well, greater government expenditure, so G is greater than T, and so it represents a budget deficit. So going over the whole curve once again, the y-axis represents the government's revenue, the x-axis represents national income, this is the government's expenditure, this is the tax revenue curve, when the 2 points or the two curves, the point at which they intersect is known as the point of balanced budget, where government expenditure equals tax revenue. At any point after that, the tax revenue outstrips government expenditure, and so we end up with a budget surplus. Over here, this is a budget surplus. At and at any point before that, we end up with a budget deficit since government expenditure outstrips tax revenue. Right. So then we can move on to the last part, which is two different parts of fiscal policy. The first part of fiscal policy is the automatic stabilization part or the automatic stabilizer part. So the thing is, whenever there is a fiscal policy, whenever there is an economy, whenever we have an economy and we have, let's say, any fiscal policy in an economy, then in that case, the fiscal policy does some things on its own. As the word automatic suggests, it does a few things which happen automatically due to the mere existence of that policy. So let's take an example of progressive taxation. So let's say if this is an economy, we have Pakistan over here, economy of Pakistan, and the national income in Pakistan is going up. So the incomes in general of people are going up, right? So at the same time, we obviously have progressive taxation. Progressive taxation is when the rate of tax is increasing, the marginal rate of tax keeps on increasing, and so the average rate of tax increases as well. And so people who are earning higher incomes end up paying more tax as compared to people earning lower incomes in terms of the percentage which they're paying. So this is progressive taxation. So if the national income was to go up, right, the aggregate demand was to go up as well. And when we use fiscal policy, we want to, as we discussed, according to the business cycle, we want to really reduce the magnitude of the fluctuations in the business cycle. And so we want to keep the aggregate demand at a more stable level. We don't want it to increase by a lot. And so this is where progressive taxation comes in. So when incomes go up, right, people's incomes go up. And so in progressive taxation, when people earn more, they end up paying more tax as the percentage of their income. So in this case, when people's income go up, now they're paying more percent. For example, let's say more people were paying 5% previously, now they're paying 10% on their income. This is a very basic example. It's not how it works, but let's just take this as an example. And so now people are paying 10%. And so, the disposable income is the income left after deducting the amount of tax paid. And so the disposable income of these people goes down, which is why we are able to keep aggregate demand at a more stable level, right? And so this is part of the automatic stabilization policy or the automatic stabilizer part of the fiscal policy. Moving on to the next part, which is discretionary fiscal policy. So the question arises, when we have this automatic stabilization part, why does the government have its own discretionary fiscal policy? Why does the government spend its resources to manipulate or carry out changes in its fiscal policy? So the thing is, the automatic stabilization part can only do so much. It can't really bring out substantial changes. It can reduce the aggregate demand by a bit and try to keep it stable. But in cases when the aggregate demand is increasing by a lot and when it's out of the control of the automatic stabilization part, it moves on to the discretionary fiscal policy part. And so this is where this guy comes in. Okay. So this includes the government's choice to either increase direct taxes directly, to increase direct taxes. If the government is employing, let's say, a contractionary fiscal policy, contractionary means contraction in demand, and so aggregate demand, sorry. And so the government wants to use a contractionary fiscal policy. The government will deliberately increase direct taxes. The government will at the same time reduce government expenditure. And the government will do the opposite. Let's say if it wants to employ an expansionary fiscal policy, then it will reduce direct taxes and increase government expenditure. So this is what the government does on its own, and the government makes deliberate decisions, or this is known as the discretionary fiscal policy because the government chooses to do all of these things. Whereas this is the automatic stabilization part. it will happen even though the government chooses to do nothing.